August 1945. Okinawa. The final days of the war. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a Marine from the 1st Division, crouched in a muddy foxhole when he heard movement in the brush ahead. His finger tightened on the trigger. Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. Everyone knew that. Suicide attacks disguised as surrenders had killed enough Americans that every Marine approached such situations with extreme caution. But the figure emerging from the jungle vegetation wasn't attacking. His hands were raised. He held a crumpled piece of paper, an American leaflet, and he was speaking. Broken, heavily accented English. Words memorized phonetically from the leaflet he clutched. I surrender. Please. Water. No. Kill. Leckie recognized the phrases. They were from the surrender instructions printed on thousands of leaflets dropped over Japanese positions. More importantly, they matched the phrases in the small booklet every American soldier in the Pacific carried. A guide teaching them how to accept enemy surrender. Leckie lowered his rifle slightly, called for his sergeant. Following the procedures outlined in their phrasebooks, they approached carefully, searched the soldier for weapons, and offered him water from a canteen. The Japanese soldier drank desperately, then began to weep. He had expected execution. Japanese military training had been explicit. Americans torture and kill prisoners. Surrender meant dishonor, followed by death. But here he was, disarmed, given water, treated not as a hated enemy, but as a human being who'd made a difficult choice. This scene repeated thousands of times across the Pacific in 1945. Japanese soldiers, starving and exhausted, emerging from caves and jungle hideouts with American leaflets, speaking memorized English phrases, prepared to die, but hoping desperately that the propaganda they'd been taught was wrong. The Americans who accepted these surrenders weren't improvising. They were following detailed instructions from small booklets issued to every soldier in the Pacific theater. Booklets teaching them not just how to accept surrender, but how to treat surrendered enemies with basic human dignity. This is the story of one of World War II's most unusual and morally complex military programs. In a war characterized by brutal combat, racial hatred, and mutual atrocities, the United States military issued detailed instructions teaching American soldiers to treat Japanese prisoners humanely. Not because it was easy, not because Japanese forces showed similar restraint, but because American military leadership believed that humane treatment of prisoners was both morally correct and strategically valuable. The Japanese never expected it. Their military had taught them that Americans were barbaric murderers who would torture prisoners. The reality that Americans carried instruction booklets about proper prisoner treatment contradicted everything they'd been told. The story begins not with battlefield necessity, but with a fundamental cultural and philosophical difference between how America and Japan approached warfare, honor, and the treatment of defeated enemies. Japanese military culture in World War II was shaped by Bushido, the warrior code emphasizing honor, loyalty, and the belief that death was preferable to the shame of capture. This wasn't ancient tradition revived for propaganda purposes. It was systematic indoctrination enforced through the entire military structure. Japanese soldiers were taught from basic training that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. A soldier who surrendered brought shame not just on himself, but on his family, his unit, his nation. Death in combat was glorious. Capture was unthinkable. This wasn't abstract philosophy. It was drilled into every recruit until it became reflexive belief. The Imperial Japanese military reinforced this through brutal discipline and social pressure. Officers who suggested retreat or surrender were often executed by their superiors. Soldiers who showed hesitation in combat faced beatings from their own comrades. The entire system was designed to make death seem preferable to any alternative. This cultural framework created the kamikaze attacks, the banzai charges, the refusal to surrender even when defeat was certain. Japanese soldiers fought to the death not because they were fanatics by nature, but because the military system had systematically removed surrender as a conceivable option. From the Japanese military perspective, this made perfect sense. A soldier who would rather die than surrender would fight harder, sacrifice more, never give up. In their framework, this created ultimate military effectiveness. But there was a crucial blind spot in this logic. Japanese military leadership assumed their enemies operated under similar principles. They believed that if Japanese soldiers wouldn't surrender, then enemy soldiers probably wouldn't either. They assumed all militaries indoctrinated their soldiers to prefer death over capture. This assumption was catastrophically wrong when applied to American military culture. American military tradition came from a fundamentally different philosophical foundation. The United States military emphasized mission accomplishment, unit cohesion, and individual judgment. American soldiers were taught to complete objectives, support their comrades, and make tactical decisions based on circumstances. Surrender, in American military doctrine, wasn't dishonorable. It was a tactical option available when continuing to fight served no purpose. A soldier surrounded with no ammunition, no hope of relief, and no ability to accomplish anything through continued resistance was expected to surrender rather than die pointlessly. This doesn't mean American soldiers were less brave or committed. It means the American military recognized that a soldier who surrenders to fight another day can be exchanged, rescued, or escape to rejoin the fight. A dead soldier is permanently gone. From a practical standpoint, surrender under hopeless circumstances made strategic sense. More importantly, American culture emphasized the value of individual human life. Democratic societies built on Enlightenment principles of individual rights don't easily embrace doctrines of mass suicide. American military leadership, shaped by this culture, approached warfare with the assumption that minimizing casualties, both friendly and enemy, was desirable when militarily feasible. This philosophical difference created a fundamental disconnect when American and Japanese forces met in combat. Americans expected Japanese soldiers to surrender when resistance became hopeless. Japanese soldiers expected Americans to fight to the death because that's what honor demanded. Both sides were confused and frustrated by the other's behavior. American forces discovered early in the Pacific War that Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered. Initial American response was cynical acceptance. If they want to fight to the death, we'll accommodate them. But military leadership recognized this created problems. First, battles became unnecessarily bloody. Japanese soldiers who might have surrendered instead fought to the death, inflicting casualties even in hopeless situations. Second, lack of prisoners meant lack of intelligence. Captured soldiers provide information about enemy positions, strength, plans. An enemy that never surrenders gives you no intelligence. Third, the fighting took on increasingly brutal character that troubled American commanders who wanted to maintain some restraint, even in total war. In 1943, American military leadership began seriously addressing this problem. How do you encourage enemy surrender when enemy culture views surrender as worse than death? The answer had two parts. First, convince Japanese soldiers that surrender wouldn't mean torture and death. Second, teach American soldiers how to accept surrender properly, so surrendering Japanese would be treated in ways that validated the decision to surrender rather than fight to death. The second part required the phrase books and instruction manuals that would become standard issue for American troops in the Pacific. The United States military, working with intelligence officers and cultural experts, developed a comprehensive program for encouraging and accepting Japanese surrender. This wasn't a hasty battlefield expedient. This was systematic planning based on cultural analysis, psychological research, and strategic thinking about how to reduce casualties on both sides. The first element was propaganda aimed at Japanese forces. Leaflets printed in Japanese were dropped on enemy positions by the millions. The leaflets explained that American forces would treat surrendering soldiers humanely according to Geneva Convention standards. They provided specific instructions for how to surrender safely. They included phrases in English that Japanese soldiers could memorize to communicate surrender intent. The leaflets were carefully designed based on intelligence about Japanese military indoctrination. They acknowledged that Japanese soldiers had been taught Americans would kill prisoners. They directly refuted this propaganda with specific promises about humane treatment. They emphasized that surrender wasn't shameful when faced with certain death. It was rational survival. Some leaflets included testimonials from Japanese soldiers who had surrendered and received good treatment. Others emphasized that family in Japan would eventually learn their loved one survived as a prisoner rather than died pointlessly. The psychological approach was sophisticated, targeting the specific fears and cultural beliefs that kept Japanese soldiers fighting to death. But propaganda alone wouldn't work if American troops didn't follow through with actual humane treatment. This is where the phrase books and prisoner handling instructions became essential. The United States military issued small, pocket-sized booklets to soldiers in Pacific theater. These booklets served multiple purposes. They included basic Japanese phrases for combat situations: halt, drop your weapon, come out. Phrases useful for ordering enemy soldiers to surrender. More importantly, they included detailed instructions for how American soldiers should treat surrendering and captured Japanese soldiers. The instructions were specific and unambiguous. When accepting surrender, American soldiers were told to, first, ensure the surrendering soldier was actually surrendering and not conducting a suicide attack. Approach cautiously, keep weapon ready. Search thoroughly for hidden weapons or grenades. Second, once confirmed as genuine surrender, treat the prisoner with basic human dignity. Offer water. Provide food if available. Give medical treatment for injuries. Do not strike, mock, or abuse the prisoner in any way. Third, remove the prisoner from the front line quickly. Japanese soldiers who had just surrendered were often terrified and might panic if left in combat areas. Getting them to rear areas where they felt safer helped prevent resistance or escape attempts. Fourth, communicate using the simple phrases provided in the booklet. Even if the prisoner spoke no English, hearing familiar phrases from the leaflets helped reassure them that the promised humane treatment was real. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, treat surrendered Japanese soldiers the same way Americans would want to be treated if captured. The booklets explicitly invoked the Golden Rule: treat others as you would wish to be treated. This wasn't just moral philosophy. It was practical guidance for soldiers who might be skeptical about extending humanity to an enemy they'd been fighting brutally. The phrase books included phonetic pronunciations for key Japanese phrases. American soldiers, most of whom spoke no Japanese, could read these phonetically and communicate basic messages. Shimpai naku, don't worry, mizu, water, tabemono, food, bioin, hospital, anzen, safe. These weren't fluent Japanese. They were functional phrases sufficient to communicate basic reassurance and care. A surrendering Japanese soldier hearing mizu and being offered a canteen, hearing tabemono and receiving rations, would understand that the promises in the American leaflets were being fulfilled. The program also included training for soldiers likely to handle prisoners, intelligence officers, military police, medical personnel. These soldiers received more detailed instruction about Japanese culture, the Bushido Code, and how to interact with prisoners in ways that respected their dignity while maintaining security. The training emphasized that many Japanese soldiers surrendering would be psychologically traumatized. They'd violated the deepest principles they'd been taught. They expected death. Instead, they were receiving water and medical care. This cognitive dissonance could produce unpredictable behavior. Some prisoners wept uncontrollably. Others became catatonic. Some became almost childlike in their relief and gratitude. American personnel were trained to handle these reactions with patience and compassion. The goal wasn't just accepting surrender. It was transitioning surrendered soldiers from terrified enemies to cooperative prisoners who might provide intelligence and, ideally, help convince other Japanese soldiers that surrender was viable. The program's effectiveness varied dramatically, depending on location and timing. In early Pacific battles like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, very few Japanese soldiers surrendered, regardless of circumstances. The cultural prohibition was too strong. American prisoner treatment reputation was unknown, and fanatical resistance was the norm. But as the war progressed, and more Japanese soldiers survived as American prisoners, word began to spread. Captured soldiers were allowed to write letters to family through Red Cross channels. Some of these letters made it to Japan or to other military units. The message was consistent and shocking. American captivity wasn't the torture and death they'd been taught to expect. It was food, medical care, safety, and treatment with basic human respect. By 1945, surrender rates among Japanese forces began increasing, though they never approached the levels common among German or Italian forces. In the final battles on Okinawa and during the preparation for invasion of the Japanese home islands, thousands of Japanese soldiers did surrender, a dramatic change from early war behavior. The phrase books and prisoner handling procedures played a crucial role in this shift. When Japanese soldiers considering surrender saw American leaflets promising humane treatment, and then experienced actual humane treatment when they surrendered, it validated the American approach. Each successful surrender and proper treatment created evidence that countered years of Japanese military propaganda. There are countless individual stories that illustrate how this system worked in practice. Sergeant Tadashi Ono, a Japanese soldier who surrendered on Okinawa in June 1945, later wrote about his experience. "I was hiding in a cave with 3 other soldiers. We had no food for 6 days, no water for 2 days. I found an American paper, leaflet in Japanese. It said we could surrender, would receive food and water and medicine. My companions said it was a trick. Americans would kill us. But I was dying already from thirst. I decided dying quickly from American bullets was better than dying slowly from thirst. I walked out of the cave holding the leaflet and the white cloth it described, hands raised. I said the English words written on the leaflet. I surrender. Please, water. No kill. The American soldiers pointed guns at me. I closed my eyes, prepared to die. Then one soldier said something and gave me a canteen. Water. I drank. They gave me more water, then food. They bandaged a wound on my leg I'd almost forgotten about. I couldn't understand why they were helping me. I had been taught Americans were devils who tortured prisoners. Instead, they treated me better than my own officers had treated me in months. Ono's experience was typical of Japanese soldiers who surrendered in 1945. The shock of humane treatment was profound and lasting. Many Japanese prisoners, once they understood they weren't going to be executed, became cooperative and even helpful to American forces. Some Japanese prisoners volunteered to help convince other Japanese soldiers to surrender. They would accompany American units to enemy positions using loudspeakers to explain in Japanese that surrender was safe and they would be treated well. These volunteers were taking enormous risks. If their own forces captured them, they'd be executed as traitors. But many felt compelled to help save other Japanese soldiers from pointless death. The phrase books also served another crucial function. They helped prevent American war crimes. Combat against an enemy that fights to the death can create intense hatred and desire for revenge. American soldiers who'd seen comrades killed in suicide attacks or by snipers hiding among civilians could easily be tempted to refuse, quarter, or mistreat prisoners. The phrase books, by providing explicit instructions about proper prisoner treatment, gave soldiers clear guidance about expected behavior. Unit commanders could point to the booklets and say, "This is how we treat prisoners. This is the American way. We're better than that." It established norms and expectations that helped maintain discipline even in brutal combat conditions. This doesn't mean American forces always followed these instructions perfectly. There were certainly instances of prisoner mistreatment, killings of surrendering soldiers, and other violations. War brings out worst impulses in some people, and the Pacific War's racial dynamics and mutual atrocities created conditions where restraint was difficult. But the phrase books and prisoner handling procedures established official policy clearly. Violations were violations of stated policy, not accepted practice. Soldiers who mistreated prisoners could be disciplined. The standard was clear, even if achieving the standard was imperfect. Contrast this with Japanese military policy toward prisoners. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention, but never ratified it. Japanese military doctrine held that soldiers who surrendered deserved no respect or humane treatment. Allied prisoners of war in Japanese custody experienced systematic brutality, inadequate food, no medical care, forced labor, physical abuse, and frequent executions. The death rate for Allied prisoners in Japanese custody was approximately 27%. More than 1 in 4 prisoners died. For comparison, the death rate for Allied prisoners in German custody was about 4%. Japanese prison camps weren't designed to kill prisoners through deliberate policy, but the combination of neglect, abuse, forced labor, and cultural contempt for captured enemies created conditions where death was common. American military leadership was aware of how Japan treated Allied prisoners. This made the American decision to treat Japanese prisoners humanely even more significant. It would have been easy to justify reciprocal brutality. They treat our prisoners horribly, so we'll do the same to theirs. But American policy explicitly rejected this logic. The reasoning was both moral and practical. Morally, American leadership believed that humane treatment of prisoners was right, regardless of enemy behavior. Democratic societies built on Enlightenment principles of human rights don't abandon those principles because enemies don't share them. The American way of war included restraint and respect for human dignity even toward enemies. Practically, reciprocal brutality would have undermined the surrender encouragement program. If American forces mistreated Japanese prisoners, word would spread, and Japanese soldiers would fight even harder to avoid capture. Humane treatment was necessary to make surrender a viable option that Japanese soldiers might choose. There was also concern about post-war reputation and relationships. American leadership understood that the war would eventually end, and relationships with Japan would need to be rebuilt. Systematic prisoner abuse would create lasting enmity and complicate post-war reconstruction. Humane treatment, even during war, could lay groundwork for eventual reconciliation. The phrase books and prisoner programs also reflected American cultural confidence. The United States didn't need to brutalize prisoners to demonstrate strength. American power was evident in industrial capacity, military success, and the ability to treat prisoners well while still winning decisively. Humane prisoner treatment, from this perspective, demonstrated civilizational superiority more effectively than cruelty would have. By late 1945, as Japan faced imminent invasion, the surrender encouragement program began showing significant results. Japanese soldiers increasingly chose surrender over suicidal last stands. The presence of American phrase books and the reputation for relatively humane treatment made surrender seem survivable rather than futile. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, millions of Japanese military personnel laid down weapons and entered American custody. The phrase books and prisoner handling procedures that had been developed for individual surrenders now scaled up to handle mass capitulation. The same principles applied. Treat surrendered enemies with basic human dignity, provide food and medicine, maintain order through fair treatment rather than brutality. The success of this approach influenced American military doctrine permanently. Post-war prisoner handling procedures incorporated lessons learned from the Pacific Phrase Book Program. The principle that humane treatment of prisoners serves both moral and practical purposes became embedded in American military culture. Modern American military training includes detailed instruction about prisoner treatment, cultural sensitivity, and the strategic value of winning hearts and minds. The phrase books from World War II were primitive compared to modern cultural training, but they established the principle that understanding and respecting enemy culture, even while fighting, serves military objectives. There's profound irony in the fact that American soldiers carried instruction booklets about accepting surrender while fighting an enemy who'd been taught surrender was unthinkable. The Japanese military never imagined Americans would systematically prepare to treat surrendering enemies humanely. It contradicted their understanding of warfare as a total struggle where only death or victory mattered. This cultural disconnect created situations where Japanese soldiers were simultaneously terrified of Americans and shocked by American restraint. They'd been taught to expect barbaric cruelty. Instead, they encountered soldiers carrying little booklets with Japanese phrases, offering water, providing medical care. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some Japanese soldiers who surrendered and received humane treatment became advocates for surrender among prisoners. They would tell other captured soldiers, "Everything we were taught about Americans was wrong. They treat us better than our own officers did. This war is over for us. We survived." These testimonials, prisoner to prisoner, were more effective than any American propaganda could be. The phrase book program also affected American soldiers' attitudes. Carrying instructions about humane prisoner treatment forced soldiers to think about enemies as human beings rather than abstract threats. Reading phrases in Japanese, learning even minimal information about enemy culture, created slight but real empathy. It's harder to dehumanize an enemy when you're learning their language, even if just a few words. This doesn't mean American soldiers suddenly viewed Japanese forces with sympathy during combat. Battle was still brutal, hatred was still real, racial prejudices were still prevalent. But in the specific moment of accepting surrender, the phrase books provided framework for interaction that acknowledged shared humanity. There were certainly American soldiers who rejected this approach, who refused to accept Japanese surrender, who wanted revenge for fallen comrades. The phrase books couldn't change everyone's attitude, but they established that humane prisoner treatment was official policy, expected behavior, and the American standard. Soldiers who wanted to live up to that standard had clear guidance about how to do so. The legacy of the Pacific Phrasebook program extends beyond World War II. Every subsequent American conflict has included some version of cultural training, phrasebooks or cards, and instructions about prisoner treatment. The principle that American forces should understand enemy culture and treat prisoners humanely has become fundamental to American military doctrine. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American soldiers carried phrase cards with Arabic and Pashto words and phrases. The specific languages changed, but the concept remained the same. Give soldiers basic tools to communicate with local populations and prisoners, emphasize cultural respect and humane treatment, recognize that winning hearts and minds matters as much as winning battles. The phrase "books from the Pacific War" were primitive by modern standards, a few dozen phrases phonetically spelled, basic cultural notes, simple instructions. But they represented a profound principle. Even in total war against an enemy that showed little reciprocal restraint, American forces would maintain standards of humane treatment because those standards defined what America fought for. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered and received humane treatment carried those memories for life. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans consistently reveal that those who surrendered to American forces were shocked by the treatment they received. Many expressed gratitude decades later for American soldiers who gave them water, food, medical care, and basic human respect when they'd expected death. There's a broader lesson here about the relationship between military effectiveness and moral restraint. The American military's willingness to treat prisoners humanely didn't weaken military performance. It enhanced it. Humane treatment encouraged surrender, which saved American lives by ending resistance. It provided intelligence from cooperative prisoners. It established moral authority that served American interests in post-war reconstruction. The phrase "books" symbolized something essential about American military culture. The belief that strength doesn't require cruelty, that victory doesn't demand abandoning human values, that democratic nations can wage total war while maintaining commitments to human dignity and the rule of law. The Japanese military never understood this. They saw restraint as weakness, compassion as vulnerability. They couldn't comprehend how the same nation that firebombed Tokyo could issue instruction booklets teaching soldiers to give water to surrendering enemies. To Japanese military leadership, these seemed contradictory. You either fight with total ruthlessness or you don't fight seriously at all. But American military culture embraced this complexity. You could drop bombs on enemy cities while treating individual prisoners humanely. You could wage total war while maintaining moral boundaries. You could be ruthlessly effective in combat while showing compassion to defeated enemies. These weren't contradictions. They were different aspects of democratic warfare. The phrase "books" represented practical implementation of this philosophy. They gave individual soldiers specific guidance about how to balance combat effectiveness with human decency. They provided framework for treating enemies as humans rather than abstractions. They embodied the principle that America fought not just to defeat enemies, but to vindicate values about human dignity and rights. When Private First Class Robert Leckie gave water to that Japanese soldier on Okinawa in August 1945, he was following instructions from a small booklet in his pocket. He wasn't improvising or making a personal moral choice. He was executing official policy that the United States military had carefully developed because leadership believed humane prisoner treatment served both moral imperatives and strategic objectives. That Japanese soldier, who'd expected execution, instead received water, food, medical treatment, and transport to a prisoner camp where he'd survive the war's end and eventually return to Japan. He'd been taught Americans were barbaric devils. Instead, he encountered a young Marine who offered him a canteen and said "mizu," water, in badly pronounced Japanese learned from a phrase book. That small act of humanity, repeated thousands of times across the Pacific in 1945, represented something profound about the American way of war. Not perfect, American forces committed atrocities and violations. Not pure, racism and hatred were real, but fundamentally different from an enemy whose military culture made surrender unthinkable and treated prisoners with systematic cruelty. The phrase books were small, simple, almost crude in their basic approach, but they embodied a powerful principle that defined American military culture. Even in total war, even against brutal enemies, even when facing racial hatred and cultural incomprehension, American forces would maintain standards of human decency because those standards were what America was fighting to preserve. The Japanese soldiers couldn't believe it. They'd been taught Americans were devils. Instead, they found young men with little booklets, offering water and food, treating them with basic kindness despite everything. That cognitive dissonance between what they'd been taught and what they experienced was perhaps America's most effective psychological warfare weapon, because it proved that everything the Japanese military had taught was wrong. And if they'd been wrong about American treatment of prisoners, what else had they been wrong about? The phrase books weren't just military equipment. They were a statement of values. They said that even in the Pacific War's brutal conditions, even fighting an enemy that almost never surrendered, even after years of savage combat, American forces would maintain standards of human decency. Not because it was easy, not because the enemy reciprocated, but because treating prisoners humanely was part of what it meant to be American forces fighting for democratic values against military tyranny. The Japanese soldiers who surrendered and received humane treatment never forgot it. Post-war testimonials are remarkably consistent. Shock at receiving water instead of bullets, confusion about why Americans would help enemy soldiers, lasting gratitude for compassion shown in desperate moments. These small acts of humanity, a canteen offered, a wound bandaged, respectful treatment despite language barriers, didn't change the war's outcome. But they changed individual lives. They saved Japanese soldiers who would have died in pointless last stands, and they demonstrated that American power included the strength to show restraint and compassion even toward enemies. The phrase books embodied this paradox. You could wage total war while maintaining moral boundaries. You could be ruthlessly effective in combat while treating defeated enemies with basic human dignity. These weren't contradictions. They were essential elements of democratic warfare that distinguished America from the totalitarian enemies it fought. If stories like this move you, the unexpected humanity in brutal war, the cultural clashes that shaped combat, the small acts of compassion that saved lives, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of War Rewind. We're uncovering the untold stories of World War II every day. Not just the battles and weapons, but the human moments that defined the war and shaped history.